Originally, it was supposed to be a flawless scam, but the hit-and-run driver immediately fled the scene. Lars and Cal quickly scrambled up and chased after the driver. To their surprise, the driver turned out to be an old Mexican lady. Lars and Cal thought they were about to strike it rich, but little did they know they were dealing with an illegal organization from Mexico. In front of his grandma, the ruthless Tuco was nothing but a well-behaved child. Lars and Cal, confident in their righteousness, started insulting the old lady without holding back. Tuco used the excuse of sending his grandma upstairs to watch TV so he could handle the situation. As soon as the door closed behind her, Lars and Cal began hinting at Tuco to pay them compensation, even threatening to call the police if he didn't pay up. But what Tuco did next would make them regret it for the rest of their lives.
You called her
Yeah, whatever, man. Please, hurry it up. I'm hurting here.
Show us the green or La Policia is gonna come and they're gonna be taking Granny away. She's gonna go to jail. You want that?
Yeah, that's right. Play it smart.
Okay, good.
No!
Grandma, who was watching TV upstairs, was always uneasy, so she opened the door to see if her grandson had taken care of things. At that moment, Tuco was cleaning up the bloodstains on the floor. He lied, saying he had taken care of Lars and Cal and assured her they would never bother her again. When the grandma asked what was on the floor, Tuco lied, saying it was tomato sauce he had accidentally spilled. The diligent grandma was about to come down to help clean, but Tuco, ever the devoted grandson, quickly stopped her. He told her not to miss her exciting TV show and that he would take care of the cleaning. Once his grandma was upstairs, Tuco immediately called his men to help deal with Lars and Cal. Just as Tuco was about to continue cleaning up the blood on the carpet, he heard a knock on the door and looked through the cat's eye to see another man at his door. Unhurried, Tuco took the hidden gun from the cabinet and went to greet the unexpected visitor. He invited Jimmy to sit down, and the shrewd Tuco quickly guessed that Jimmy must be with the other two. However, before Jimmy could explain, the grandma came downstairs again. Not wanting to alarm her, Tuco hid the gun behind his back and lied, saying Jimmy was a salesman. Jimmy noted Tuco's dutiful grandson act in front of his grandma. After she went back upstairs, Tuco continued to interrogate Jimmy with the gun, driven by a strong will to survive. Jimmy used all his rhetorical skills and maxed out his emotional intelligence. Jimmy first admits that his two stupid clients had a traffic accident and that they were unaware that they were following your beloved grandmother to this cozy house. In short, Jimmy praises Tuco to the skies and belittles him and Lars and Cal to the core. Seeing the bloodstains on the floor, Jimmy guessed that Lars and Cal had already met a grim fate. If they were dead, Jimmy would leave immediately and pretend nothing had happened. If Lars and Cal were still alive, killing them would not benefit Tuco. Jimmy assured him that the lesson he had given them would be remembered for a lifetime. The three of us will get far away and never dare to bother you and your lovely grandma again.
You got a mouth on you.
Thank you.
Everyone likes to hear flattery. Tuco felt that this unknown little lawyer made a lot of sense, so he took out a knife and told Jimmy to untie Lars and Cal. But to Jimmy's shock, the moment he removed the tape from Lars's mouth, the brainless Lars turned on him. Lars blamed everything on Jimmy, saying it was Jimmy who instructed them to follow Tuco's grandma. The lie Jimmy had just concocted was instantly exposed. I'm not afraid of a godlike opponent, but I'm afraid of a pig-like teammate. Hearing this, Tuco, who had planned to let them go, changed his mind again.
For what? For what are you getting $2 grand?
It's for going after your grandma. It's for taking a header over a car and then for bracing her. It was him, I swear. It was the lawyer.
At this point, Jimmy was powerless to explain. The scene shifted to the three of them being thrown into the desert by Tuco, who continued to press Jimmy for the truth. Jimmy confessed everything, saying he originally planned to fake an accident with Betsy's car. He also revealed that Craig had embezzled $5 million in public funds. He took this desperate measure specifically to become the cattleman's lawyer, but who could have guessed that Tuco's grandma's car was the same model as Betsy's, causing those two idiots to follow the wrong person? Although Jimmy's words were entirely true, Tuco no longer believed his story. Tuco ordered his henchman Nacho to bring the toolbox from the car. Intending to torture the truth out of Jimmy, he clamped a pair of pliers on Jimmy's fingers, but Jimmy insisted he was a lawyer and handed Tuco his matchbook advertisement. Tuco glanced at it and threw the matchbook away, his suspicious nature making him still doubt Jimmy's explanation. Seeing that this lunatic was about to cut off his fingers, Jimmy, in desperation, claimed he was an undercover federal agent. This finally struck a chord with Tuco, and Jimmy's fingers were spared. Because Tuco's recent deal had been targeted by the police, he suspected Jimmy was an undercover cop. Nacho then requested to interrogate Jimmy himself. When Nacho asked why Jimmy was investigating him, the case's name, and what they were selling, Jimmy started fabricating lies again. Jimmy's explanation was stuttering, and he flatteringly described the operation as Operation Topple the King. This made Tuco burst into laughter. The rational Nacho, unlike the erratic Tuco, saw that Jimmy wasn't telling the truth. He asked Tuco for the pliers, threatening Jimmy that if he didn't speak honestly, he would indeed lose his fingers. Helpless, Jimmy had no choice but to sincerely confess everything.
I'm James Morgan McGill. I'm a lawyer. I was trolling for business. Okay, that's the truth. Now you find a Bible, I'll swear.
Okay, what about Operation Kingbreaker,
I made
FBI?
it up. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know you. I don't want to. This was a mistake. Okay, it's my mistake. Okay, I take full and complete responsibility, but I don't know any of your names, and I got a bad case of face blindness. You let us go, we're gonna forget this happened. Guys, we're gonna forget, right? Nod your heads. Okay? So, if you just let us go, we wanna just go home.
After hearing Jimmy's explanation, Nacho believed they posed no real threat to Tuco and suggested letting them go.
Croaking a lawyer for no reason is bad business. He goes away, someone's gonna come look for him.
They walked into my house. They disrespected my abuelita. They called her, and they just walk.
Seeing Tuco's displeasure, Nacho tried his best to save Jimmy alone, leaving Lars and Cal to Tuco's discretion. Tuco reluctantly accepted Nacho's suggestion. Nacho picked up Jimmy's matchbook advertisement that Tuco had thrown away. He warned Jimmy that he now knew his address and that Jimmy should be clear about the consequences. Jimmy's life was spared, thanks to Nacho. Nacho's behavior here is also a setup for the later episodes, and the answer is about to be revealed when you see the end of the video. Although he was free, Jimmy's still worried about Lars and Cal's safety. After all, he was the one who brought Lars and Cal into this, and if they died, his conscience would never be at peace. Jimmy wanted to save Lars and Cal but was stopped by Nacho, just as Tuco took out a knife, ready to act. Jimmy, ignoring Nacho's obstruction, tried his best to salvage the situation. During the conversation between Tuco and his grandma, Jimmy noticed how important family was to Tuco. He lied, claiming that Lars and Cal had a poor, widowed mother who worked hard every day as a maid to support these two kids. If Tuco killed them today, it would be like killing that poor mother. Jimmy tried to use family feelings to gain Tuco's sympathy. He continued to praise Tuco, elevating him like a judge dispensing justice, although they were at fault. You, sir, have already beaten them half to death. Lars and Cal would be terrified of you for the rest of their lives. Jimmy hoped Tuco would show leniency. While they were bargaining, Tuco's henchman Nodos interrupted with a few words, only to be warned by Tuco to stay silent. However, Nodos, not learning his lesson, would later be beaten to death by Tuco for speaking out of turn in Breaking Bad. Jimmy suggested to Tuco that he could break their legs, so they couldn't skateboard and cause trouble anymore. Tuco looks at Jimmy for being so respectful to him. Tuco takes Jimmy's advice. Thus, through his conscience and cleverness, Jimmy managed to save Lars and Cal's lives from Tuco. Without direct shots, the sound in Jimmy's expressions alone conveyed Tuco's cruelty to the fullest. After the three successfully escaped, Jimmy took them to the hospital right away.
Where's the lawyer? Hey, I just talked you down from a death sentence.
To relieve his stress, Jimmy went to a bar that evening to relax and even struck up a conversation with a charming lady. But who would have thought that this pleasant encounter would be interrupted by someone nearby crunching cookies? The crisp sound made Jimmy think of the bone-cracking noise when Tuco broke Lars and Cal's bones, clearly leaving a deep psychological scar on him. After a terrible day, a drunken Jimmy returned to his brother's house. As usual, Chuck reminded Jimmy to leave his phone in the mailbox outside, but Jimmy was too inebriated to comply. Jimmy stripped off his clothes and collapsed on the sofa, falling into a deep sleep. Concerned, Chuck covered Jimmy with a blanket and then checked if Jimmy had left his phone outside. As Chuck expected, the thoroughly drunk Jimmy had forgotten to leave his phone outside. Chuck used tongs to grab the phone, handling it like a dangerous creature, and quickly flung it outside. This showed that Chuck couldn't directly sense the phone's presence but reacted strongly only after seeing it. This suggested that Chuck's condition was psychological and that his aversion to these items was actually a manifestation of his bias against Jimmy. This point is further proven in many subsequent episodes. After regaining his composure, Chuck sees the emergency room order that Jimmy brought back with him, which is exactly what Jimmy paid for Lars and Cal's broken bones, etc. The next day, when Jimmy woke up, he found Chuck wearing a space blanket, ready to confront him. Jimmy asked Chuck why he was wearing a space blanket, and Chuck said it was because Jimmy had brought his phone into the house last night. Jimmy apologized and asked where his phone was, and Chuck said he had thrown it outside. Jimmy saw the emergency room bill on the table and guessed that Chuck had already seen it. Because he was broke, Jimmy worried that Chuck would think the money came from dubious means, possibly suspecting Jimmy of resorting to his old tricks, because 10 years ago, Jimmy was arrested and imprisoned for fraud. Later, Jimmy swore never to reoffend, and only then did Chuck bail him out of jail. In the years since, Jimmy had genuinely reformed and avoided illegal activities. Jimmy quickly assured Chuck that the money was legitimate and swore he wouldn't go back to his old ways. Jimmy knew that if he made a mistake, Chuck would put on the space blanket as a sign of rejection. Jimmy repeatedly urged Chuck to take off the space blanket to prove he hadn't done anything wrong. Reluctantly, Chuck took it off. However, as soon as Jimmy stepped out the door, Chuck immediately put the space blanket back on. Though it was just a thin space blanket, it created a vast distance between the two brothers. In the following period, Jimmy stayed out of trouble. To secure the public defender cases he once looked down upon, he spared no expense in buying the contract administrator's favorite dolls to win her favor.
Got something for me?
Having sorted out his emotions, Jimmy had no other choice. The clients Jimmy received were all bizarre criminals, but he didn't show a bad attitude. Instead, he faced each case with great enthusiasm, just as he had to face his difficult life with the same vigor. To defend a kid who stole a pizza, Jimmy spent all day chasing the prosecutor, pleading for leniency. However, the prosecutor only replied that the other party had a history of theft. Jimmy was busy from morning till night every day, not even having time to greet his friend Kim. Mike, the parking lot attendant, still stopped Jimmy for missing stickers, never letting him through even once. After finishing his cases, Jimmy returned to his office, still without any voicemails from clients. Since there is no work to do, then simply relax. He puts the chair on the desk and pushes the desk to the side. The sofa turns into a sofa bed in a second. Jimmy poured himself some of his long-cherished liquor, ready to enjoy a rare moment of leisure. At that moment, the nail salon owner knocked on his door to inform him that a client had arrived. Jimmy hurriedly got up and restored the office to its original state in preparation for receiving the client. To Jimmy's surprise, the client was none other than Tuco's henchman, Nacho. Nacho says that he came alone and Tuco doesn't know it, and reveals the purpose of his visit. Because in the desert, he heard that Jimmy wanted to blackmail the Kettleman couple's stash more than $1.5 million. Nacho was interested in this money. This was also why Nacho helped Jimmy out of his predicament in the desert. Nacho said he liked robbing thieves because they wouldn't dare call the police. He wanted Jimmy to provide information and promised a 10% commission. However, as a lawyer, Jimmy knew this was a crime. He stuck to his principles and refused to participate. But Nacho reminded Jimmy that the only reason he was still alive and in his office was entirely because of Nacho's help. Jimmy expressed his gratitude and offered to provide Nacho with free legal services. But that wasn't what Nacho needed at the moment. He left his phone number with Jimmy and told him to think it over. Nacho then swaggered out of the nail salon. Jimmy was once again in a difficult predicament.